Hey loves, it's LaDawn Black and I'm back with the latest edition of Getting Social. This is my online feature that delves into a subject that you think you have a strong opinion on and opens it up to where you may just change your mind. Today my guest is Melissa Broudo. She is the legal director for Decriminalize Sex Work. She's going to talk to us about the START Act and how it's impacting New Yorkers and how you should reach out to your representatives today to make sure the START Act gets passed. So what exactly is the START Act and why should you support it? Back in 2009, New York became the first state in the country to allow courts to clear convictions from a trafficking survivor's criminal record. But the law only allows survivors to clear prostitution-related offenses. It doesn't address the other offenses that traffickers compel labor and sex trafficking victims to commit. As we all know, a criminal record imposes lifelong detrimental effects, including limiting access to employment and education opportunities, financial resources, and housing. A criminal record can also result in severe immigration consequences, including the threat of deportation and the inability to adjust immigration status or become a citizen. So what exactly does the START Act do? New York State used to be a leader in the support for survivors of trafficking, but now New York is falling behind. A recent report evaluating record relief for trafficking victims gave New York a failing grade. The START Act will fix this by allowing survivors the opportunity to petition a court to clear convictions for all offenses that were a result of being trafficked, empowering judges to evaluate evidence and make a determination about whether relief is appropriate, allowing victims of labor trafficking to petition for relief, and offering critical protection to immigrant victims. Ensures that survivor information is kept confidential. Clarifies that a trafficking survivor does not need to demonstrate rehabilitation or good character in order to be eligible for relief. Let's be clear, though, on what the START Act doesn't do. It doesn't change the current prostitution or human trafficking laws on the books. It doesn't impact ongoing open criminal cases or investigations. And it doesn't automatically clear any charge without input from a prosecutor and careful court review. To shed more light on the START Act, how it relates to International Women's Day, and what we all can do to support it, Melissa Broudo is here with me. She is the legal director of Decriminalize Sex Work, and she's going to break it all down to us right now. Hey, Melissa, tell us what the START Act really is.
So the START Act stands for Survivors of Trafficking Attaining Relief Together. It is a bill that would expand New York's vacatur law. So I'll explain what that means because it can sound very wonky. So in New York and many other states, survivors of human trafficking can vacate, or in some other states, expunge or seal their records that arose as a result of being trafficked, right? So somebody is forced to engage in any form of trafficking, sexual or other forms of labor, and they're forced to do a variety of things at the behest of their trafficker under force, fraud, or coercion. And some of those activities may be criminal. And therefore they have arrests, whether they're prostitution arrests or drug possession, etc., and then have this lasting lifelong criminal record that follows them around and impedes their ability to move forward their lives, right? Or to restart their life, which is also why we named it the START Act. And so this would expand our existing vacatur law in New York. So New York was the first state in the entire country that had this bill introduced and passed in 2009. It was implemented in 2010. And at that time, we were the only state in the country that had this remedy specifically for survivors of human trafficking. And because it was such a wonderful thing, so many other states, in fact, most states at this point, have this remedy. And most states also exceed our remedy in that it's more expansive. It allows survivors more access to vacatur or expungement, meaning it allows them to vacate either all convictions or all nonviolent convictions, certainly a larger amount of convictions or type of convictions than our bill allows, currently our law allows, which is prostitution convictions. And the judge in New York can take other action as is necessary to vacate other convictions, but it's sort of an extra hurdle when a victim shows up and has other convictions that are not prostitution.
There was a Times article where you worked with a woman out of Queens, and it was like 129 things you were able to get removed from her record. Talk to us a little bit, as much as you can, about that particular case.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting being, a New Yorker and seeing the trajectory of prostitution arrests and also just of patterns of sex, the sex industry in New York City over time, right, which has changed dramatically in a lot of ways. And I say that because in this particular case, as in and so many other cases that I had when I was an attorney with the Sex Workers Project, is, individuals that were trafficked during the 80s and 90s, when there was a lot more street-based prostitution than there is now for a wide variety of reasons, mainly the internet. But there was a lot more street-based work happening in New York City, and a lot more arrests because it was more visible, and also because it was before there was any kind of understanding around human trafficking, right? Of course, trafficking existed, obviously, but the legal terms were not coined. And so there was just this cycle of arrests that were occurring in New York City and elsewhere, but obviously New York City is quite populous, and there was definitely a very visible sex trade. So like my former client and so many other women, it would just be this cycle of arrests. And so that case obviously had a very high volume, but it was not unusual for, again, in the 80s and 90s, for people to, and 70s, of course, have dozens and dozens, if not over 100 cases on their record. It's pretty horrific, right? That this, not that our system is in any shape or form ideal now, but there is a difference, and there is not only much more indoor work, which is safer, but also I think somewhat more of an understanding from law enforcement. Again, we have a long ways to go. So in this particular case, if she wouldn't make enough money from sex work, she had to steal things, and there was a whole elaborate shoplifting regime that her trafficker had. And unfortunately, if you steal over a certain amount of money, it's a felony. So, which is insane. But, she was left with felony convictions on her record, right? Which made applying for jobs absolutely impossible. It was just like, forget it, right? You show up somewhere. I remember she would go to job fairs and she would show up and they'd be like, sorry, New York, actually, we have one of the way better laws around asking about prior criminal convictions, and a lot of other states, they ask about arrests, right? Not only convictions, but they will ask, right, depending on the job. And they even though they cannot legally hold it against you if it's not relevant to the job, they will.
Because they heard it.
Exactly. They're human. And I would argue that being convicted of prostitution shouldn't prevent you from getting any job, in the world. But certainly shoplifting, you can make an argument, a legal argument. I'm not saying I agree with it, but you can make a legal argument that perhaps you wouldn't want to hire a particular person, like if in retail, for example. Right. So, there was significant prejudice, right, against her in obtaining a job. And she herself was a citizen, but for clients that are not, there is this insurmountable immigration burden, right? Which
Right.
is really life or death, especially for a lot of the trans clients. We represented, when I was at the Sex Workers Project, so many trans Latina women from a specific neighborhood in Queens, in Jackson Heights, where the arrests are still very high. Thank God we don't, the Penal Law 24037 was just repealed in New York, the walking while trans ban, right? So we'll certainly see a decline. But that being said, I'm sure they're going to arrest certain populations for other things. They'll just call it something different. Again, it's all baby steps. It's certainly, I'm not saying that I'm not thrilled that we're not repealing that one law, but I also know that won't solve every problem, especially for the most marginalized communities. So yeah, I mean, I think having criminal convictions, it impacts some, person's life in every arena possible.
Because I think one of the points that you made is that it places people in a financial crisis, really. I mean, you're locked into only certain types of jobs. You're fearful of applying for certain jobs because you might, have an immigration issue, that this can sort of, really blow into something really big for people and stop their growth.
Definitely. I mean, I remember I had a lot of clients who wanted to be care workers, paid care workers, right? Home health aides. And I mean, I think, for a lot of women, not to be too gendered, that is a natural profession, caring.
Right.
And I would argue actually a lot of similar crossover from sex work. Certainly not saying trafficking and sex work are the same, of course not, but there's sort of certain skills, and to become a registered home health aide in New York, and I'm sure in every other state, it's quite rigorous. You have to go through numerous background checks, and to me, somebody who has survived exploitation and genuinely wants to help other people and care for other people, they would be the perfect person, because they are imbued with a sense of empathy and care. So it was such a tragedy that for so many of our clients, before they vacated their convictions, they couldn't become a home health attendant, a nurse's aide, a nurse, right? So many other receive financial aid at school. And I think things are shifting. I think that especially there's a lot of criminal justice work in New York, ban the box, right, to not have to report all of your criminal convictions. But again, it is, I think, emotionally a very big burden for somebody to even fear being asked about these things when they go into a job interview.
So let's plug it into International Women's Day. It's coming up on Monday, March 8th. How do you think the START Act is really sort of a bill or legislation that'll support women as we move forward?
So the majority of people that are arrested for prostitution related crimes in New York overwhelmingly are identified as female. And police at this point are not identifying people. They're saying male or female, right? As a very binary sort of check mark, which obviously is inadequate. But the fact that the vast majority of people, certainly that were arrested for loitering for the purpose of engaging in prostitution, I don't remember the exact number, but it was like 80+%, right?
Wow.
A tremendous majority identified as female. So either cisgender females or trans women. And the vast majority of people arrested for prostitution are cis or trans women, non-binary individuals. So I think this is definitely a gender issue. Of course, men are trafficked and engage in sex work. There's no question about that. But the vast majority of people that are arrested are women. So there's definitely a tie-in when we start to acknowledge that survivors should not be criminalized. People arrested for prostitution, which, hopefully one day going forward, we can get there where we're not criminalizing anybody for prostitution. But we're not quite there yet, but
we'll get there.
We'll get there. certainly anyone that was forced
Right.
into prostitution and arrested, or forced into any form of labor and arrested. Again, it's going to be predominantly women, certainly when you look at prostitution related arrests.
So talk to me a little bit about how we can support the START Act. What should we do now? How can we support?
So, we're really gearing up on International Women's Day on the 8th, which is really soon, for a social media push and a calling your elected official push, right? If you're somebody that's listening and you're like, well, okay, this sounds important, but I don't know what to do. Call your state official, right? If you're a New York resident, you can look up your assembly member and your senator, put in a call and an email. Calls mean a lot to them. Emails are great as well, but they actually will really like, oh, wow, we had 7 people call us on the START Act. Okay, that is noted, right? That is going straight to the legislator. Look up your elected official, call them, email them. I think especially if you are somebody that lives in potentially more of a swing district, right? I mean, New York is primarily Democratic, of course, but there are more moderate Democratic or even Republican districts in New York State,
right?
As well as New York City, right? If we look at, maybe parts of the Rockaways or Staten Island, a little bit more moderate, and certainly when you get out to Long Island, those are really key to let your elected officials know that you care about this issue and that you support this issue and you want them to support this issue. I think that something we've seen in New York, obviously last year, everything, of course, was impacted by COVID, obviously. But in the year prior, when we were doing lobbying and even right up until COVID, there was a very big fear around criminal justice reform in more of these moderate districts, right? New York City generally not so worried, but in more marginal districts, they did worry that their constituents would push back. And I would say when it comes to something like this is really a victims' rights issue. Yes, it impacts the criminal justice system, but we're looking at survivors of human trafficking, right? We're looking at people that really, truly deserve and need a second chance to move forward with their lives, for their families, for themselves. And so, I would hope that this is something that elected officials aren't afraid of it being an unpopular issue. And the way they know that is by their constituents calling them and voicing their support.
So Melissa, thanks so much for hanging out with me just for a few minutes to talk about the START Act and how we can all get involved. And could you tell everyone where they could find out more information about Decriminalize Sex Work and all the great work that you guys do?
Definitely. Please check out our website at decriminalizesexwork.org. And, feel free to contact us, info@dswork.org. You could check out our website. We have tons of different fact sheets, videos. We're just trying to compile as much information so that people can utilize it to be advocates, whether they're independent individuals or with an organization. We really want to be a go-to resource for people to get informed, to contact their elected officials, to be engaged and, really push for bodily autonomy, and for people to, be able to attain their human rights, regardless of what their profession is, or their gender, or their sexuality.
Many thanks to Melissa Broudo for spending a few minutes with me today to talk about the START Act, its importance to New Yorkers, and how you should call and email your representatives today to let them know to pass it. For more information on the START Act, make sure you visit Decriminalize Sex Work online at decriminalizesex.work. Also, you can follow them on Instagram and Twitter for the latest updates. Decrim Sex Work on both. As always, I hope that getting social opens up your mind, opens up your heart, and maybe you view something differently just by getting social and getting to know someone on the other side. Make sure you like, share, comment, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so that you can get the next edition of Getting Social.